It is the pursuit of these corporate objectives which has justified the downsizing and re-engineering policies and practices which have been the subject of much criticism in recent years. So corporations then have acquired a special place in our world. They stand apart from the people who are inside them, act entirely in the pursuit of their own best interests, and both consume and generate huge quantities of money and wealth. The 20th century will be remembered as the century dominated by economics. The prime objectives pursued in the last century were economic growth and international competitiveness, and the assumption was that all other issues would be solved if we achieved these two. For much of the world and for most of the century, it seemed that this assumption was valid. Certainly, human beings live longer and are healthier, and on average have accumulated more wealth at the end of the century than at its beginning. But it's interesting to explore which of the components of current corporate and economic life apply to the three case studies with which I began this presentation. The businesses in at least two of the case studies do not appear to have simple, clear-cut goals that they are following. What is the objective of the human body? What is the goal of the internet? What is clear from all three examples, however, is that the various components of the business must interact in a highly cooperative way in order for the business to remain viable. Competition between the organs of the body or between termites in the mound is counterproductive to the success of the enterprise. Notwithstanding the high degree of cooperation between the various components of the business, all three examples also reveal the crucial role played by each individual constituent and emphasise how important it is that all contributors understand and deliver what is expected of them. The body could not function if the kidneys did not remove waste. The internet would cease to exist without people creating their own web pages and posting them. The prominent focus which economic objectives have attained in recent years has not been without its critics. One of the most compelling critiques has been written by the French author Viviane Forester and has been translated into English as The Economic Horror. For those interested in pursuing these matters in more detail, I'd also recommend two other books: Tyranny of the Bottom Line, Why Corporations Make Good People Do Bad Things by Ralph Estes, or The Post-Corporate World, Life After Capitalism by David C. Corton. As a futurist, my interest in these matters is to consider what alternatives might exist, and most importantly, how they might be implemented. Clearly, the economic miracle of the 20th century is very real. The world's people are, on average, healthier and wealthier at the end of the 20th century than they were at the beginning. However, it is just as clear that many problems have been created, or at least exacerbated, by the focus on economic success criteria. Many people from many different parts of the world have proposed alternatives. Some attempt to redesign economic measures such as the GDP to include social and ecological indicators. Others work with corporations to become more family and environment friendly. Still others examine how technological innovations might provide an opportunity for the greater involvement of citizens whenever crucial decisions are being made. My friend and mentor, Robert Theobald, who died just 2 months ago, suggested that success in the 21st century would require radically different criteria from those which provided success in the 20th century. His 3 success criteria for the future are effective decision-making, ecological integrity, and social cohesion. And these seem to me to encompass the issues that we need to face. As I explored these issues, I was overwhelmed by the range of alternatives that deep-thinking people had proposed. I was also struck by how difficult it can be for ordinary people to connect with some of these ideas and to see how they might contribute to changing the way that their organisations function. I have, however, come across a conceptual model which I find easy to grasp and which has helped me judge the proposals and ideas which confront me. This model was originally conceived by scientist Arthur Koestler in a groundbreaking book called The Ghost in the Machine in 1969. However, it has been significantly developed by a remarkable American called Ken Wilber and is most powerfully explored in a 1987 book he wrote called A Brief History of Everything. Ken Wilber is a Buddhist and spiritualist and has a remarkably fresh and clear way of explaining complex issues. And this model is an attempt to explore how things are organised. It provides a framework for the structure of organisations as well as of thoughts and ideas. The basis of the model is an entity called a holon. A holon is a unit of organisation and it has 2 fundamental properties. A holon is an independent unit in its own right, and it is simultaneously part of a larger unit. A simple example will help to explain. An atom is a holon. It is a unit in its own right, though of course it's made up of smaller entities, which are also holons, as we shall see. But an atom is also part of larger units called molecules. An atom can be examined in its own right and its properties explored. These properties are very predictable and stable. An atom can also be examined as part of a molecule. Although it retains its original properties, these can be modified when it combines with other atoms. The molecule can also be examined as an identity and its properties determined. These properties will incorporate the properties of the atoms in certain ways, but will also be unique to the molecule. The significance of this model is the recognition that nature organises everything holonically. Everything in nature is a holon. The human body, for example, builds on atoms and molecules to create organs and systems and ultimately a complete and distinct living entity. So it is with many things humans have created. Words, for example, are entities in their own right with their own meanings. Yet they are made up of letters that are also units in their own right. And words are also part of larger entities such as speeches and books. However, many human creations do not resemble holons. In particular, while many of our organisational and societal structures appear to exist as entities in their own right, they do not necessarily link holonically with other structures. Corporations are in fact most often deliberately set up to stand apart, not only from those who work inside them, but also from other corporations with whom they compete fiercely. The people who make up corporations seem similarly expected to bring only a part of themselves to work and to leave a part of themselves at home. At a societal level, too many of us feel isolated and alone, expected to fend for ourselves, and finding it hard to see where we fit into a bigger picture. Why is it that we seem to be capable of operating holonically in some situations, but not in others? Perhaps there is a historical lesson here. The truly holonic human structures, such as language and kinship structures, have been with us for millennia. We have refined and shaped our use and understanding of language, for example, over perhaps 50,000 years. Our corporate structures and work organisations, on the other hand, have a perhaps 200-year history. As well, language is ubiquitous, shared by us all, whereas participation in work and employment has been restricted to a select few for only a part of their lives. The most effective organisations, including termite mounds, human bodies and enlightened corporations, provide an opportunity for all to find a useful and meaningful place, to meet a real need, and to see how what they do fits with others. The human race once knew how to create such organisations for most, if not all, of its members. I hope as we enter a new millennium that we haven't forgotten.
Thank you, Charles. Let us begin the first question and answer session. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. Therefore, we ask that only one question be asked per phone call, and that these questions be as brief as possible. You may call the studio directly at the phone numbers or fax which appear on your screen. We remind you to make your phone calls at a distance from the monitor to help avoid feedback. And our first question comes to us today from Cuba, from the Senia Internet in La Habana. And if we may have the question, please.
Buenos días. Our company called Firmatel intends to present a question to the experts. In this case, the comment is related to the fact that governments should adjust and change their laws and regulations in order to adapt to the new global changes that we are seeing all over the place and that will be happening in the future. So our question is, what specific suggestions can you offer in order to modernize the laws and regulations, labor laws, in order for them to be a little more equitable for both employers and employees? And so could you elaborate a little more on what you have just presented in your module? Thank you.
That's a great question, and obviously we're going to throw this one out to Charles to begin with, but let's go to the governmental scene.
This is a really difficult and very relevant question. Governments have a very difficult time of things at the moment. First of all, they are, by definition, responsible only for a small geographic area and a small group of people in an increasingly global world, and they're struggling to find their role. There's also the issue that inside each country, each government has its own internal circumstances to deal with, which make things, this is a really interesting and fascinating question. But I think for me, the first fundamental principle that I think all governments ought to apply is that they ought to be very careful about making any law for anything. the first principle ought to be, let's try and find a way to have it work rather than trying to mandate the way it works. I think in your introduction, Dan, you made comment about the changing state of labour regulations around the world. And what we do see as we look around the world where different countries have taken different approaches, some very prescriptive, some much more laissez-faire to this labour law area, but it is very hard to predict what the results are going to be. So my first principle would be stay out of it for as long as you can. Allow the thing to work as best you can.
Okay, just real quickly then, Bill, you're working with a lot of major American organizations. How would they sense this question of governmental intervention and looking to the future?
I think they would probably endorse the position Charles has sketched out. I think it's important also to remember that governments respond to situations as they unfold. It's very hard for a government to get ahead of a situation. And in the case of the industrial order that we're all living with now, the governments were very slow to acknowledge the industrial order. And we're trying to move a little faster today, but I think Charles is right. The lead needs to be taken by organizations.
Very good. Thank you both for those insights. The next question comes to us from the Universidad of La Salle and Pachuca Hidalgo. Thank you very much for your question.
Buenos días. Good morning. Our question is the following. How can we achieve that the collaborators of an organization feel part of it if their interests are different and even if they are counterposed to those of the organization or corporation?
That's an insightful question.
Esta es una pregunta.
Very insightful. Charles, go ahead and run with that one.
This will be good, I think, because we might get two different answers here between Bill and I. As I tried to say in my presentation, we've given the organisation a special place in this world, as though just because it exists, it ought to have a right to continue to exist. I question that. So my answer to your question would be to start with what is in the interests of the people and then find a way of allowing those interests to be expressed and create organisations based on that, rather than assuming that there is some societal or business need that needs to be met and create an organisation and then shovel the people into that organisation.
Okay.
But I'd be interested in Bill's response.
Well, I guess I start a little more with the assumption that the organizations themselves already exist and that they have purposes and that the individuals have somewhat different purposes. In that case, there are two things. One, I think that organizations need to understand the individual's interests a lot better than they do. And very often understanding those interests allows them to adapt their purposes to those interests rather than imposing them on the interests. Sometimes people take positions which don't clearly express the interests. And if we know what their interests are, we can work better with them. But there is no answer to that question that's going to do away with the conflict between the individual and the group. There's going to be inherently some basic conflict there when the opposing interests collide.
Change will not mandate total agreement.
No, total agreement is an ideal, but is not something you can assure yourself of.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you very much. Great question. Our next question comes to us from the Federación Nacional in Medellín, Colombia.
Our question is the following. Good morning. If one of the main features of the corporate structure right now is decreasing the responsibility of the employers because of an integral performance, what is the theory, the systemic theory nowadays then? Thank you.
Let's go to Bill on this one. The systemic nature of change, responsibility of organizations.
Well, I'm not quite sure what the question is asking. Can we get a little...
Do we still have the caller on the line?
Oh, help, we've lost.
He's right there.
Yes.
The question is the following. The corporate structure currently, according to the presentations, tends to have people have less responsibility toward integral and corporate performance. In other words, they have now a more restricted view of what is going on in the organization. So according to that concept, what relation is there between the systemic or global vision of the organization, the global, the general view, as opposed to this specific view, more specific focus of the employee that doesn't get to see the whole? So what's the relationship then between those two theories?
Okay. One thing that I'm seeing organizations doing to close that gap somewhat is informing their employees a great deal more than employees used to be informed in the past. This is informing them not only about the reasons for doing specific things, but teaching them the basic process of business so that they understand what a business needs to do to make money and to stay vital. I think that's one thing that organizations do to try to close that gap between their outlook and the employee's outlook.
Very good. Thank you. We're going to shift into our next question, which comes to us from the Serviço Nacional in Porto Alegre, Brazil. We look forward to your question, please.
Okay. Hello?
Yes, your question, please.
We'd like to know to Dr. Brez. The question is to Dr. Brez or even to Dr. Bridget. It's not from Porto Alegre, it's from Erechim, okay, Rio Grande do Sul.
Thank you.
If there is a relationship between the high rate of unemployment and the environment of work, is there a relationship between the high rate of unemployment and the environment of work?
I think I heard unemployment.
Yes,
Could you tell us?
Yes. In fact, thank you for repeating that question because I actually heard it two different ways. So let me answer it both ways. The first way that I heard it was there a relationship between high unemployment and the state of the environment? And I'd like to make a comment about that because it is certainly true in many of the countries that I visit that a fundamental conflict exists between the objectives of many businesses and the environment. And one way in which that conflict is played out, as many businesses are able to get things done with less people, is higher unemployment. And what we're starting to see now is some very intelligent economics being applied to that question so that it's possible to build a respect for the environment into the way business does things, and that brings people back into it. But the second way that I heard your question was a relationship between high unemployment and the sort of economic environment that is out there. And I think that's this question about the whole impact of globalization and technology. It is now possible for most corporations to do most of the things they want or need to do with less people. And so the real challenge we are facing, as I tried to say in my presentation, is how do we get things done in the future? Not how do we make sure that people have jobs, but how do we get done what needs doing in such a way that people can sustain themselves? And we're in a transition at the moment, and that's why we're seeing such high unemployment. I think in the future we'll start seeing ourselves, organising ourselves differently so that people do get to do the things that need doing, but not necessarily in the same way that corporations have organised themselves in the past.
It's not so much seeking employment as it is being employable, so you can go to multiple places if need be.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Charles. Our question comes from Panama in the Regional Calón, the Universidad Tecnológico. If we may have your question, please.
We're reaching a new millennium, and we are very interested in increasing the quality of life of our employees at all levels. What would you say, tell the politicians and the private enterprise for them that they should change so that we can achieve these things?
Let's kind of hit this one quick. One thing an enterprise must change, Charles.
In this, all of the people listening to this broadcast will be the fact that this is a global program will have people think globally. The thing that I would have governments and organisations do is look locally. What needs doing at your level, at where you are, and how can we get it done?
The thing that I think I would want to see is for governments to help organizations, to encourage organizations to offer varieties of different kinds of employment, so that it isn't just simply blocks of time, you work 9 hours and that's being employed, but there are different ways to be employed that fit different people's actual situations.
Ultimately, we're seeking productivity and maximizing someone's capability regardless of their focus on any given day. The Universidad de Occidente en Los Michos, Sinaloa, comes to us with our next question.
What is the future of the universities of the third world countries as far as organization of academic work in order to achieve success?
I think you both can handle that, but Charles, start, and then we'll shift over to Bill.
Well, I have to say I feel very inadequate in answering that question, since I know very little about third world universities. But I do know that in my country we have seen a significant change in universities, and we've gone from a large number of small, sometimes specialist universities to a small number of very large universities in the last 15 or 20 years, and we're starting to question whether that's in fact the right way to go. And we believe that in fact we might be better off if we left some of these specialist institutions to concentrate on what they do best. So to the extent that you're seeing that trend in your country, maybe that's my answer.
I think to that I would add that in such countries, the university has usually been part of the preparation for a kind of professional class. And I think that in the future, the need is going to be for people to operate in a more entrepreneurial way to solve the problems of the society, of the country. And in that sense, the university needs to shift its focus away from training lawyers, training doctors, training civil servants for a professional life, to training people to solve problems, to move in and deal with new situations. And I think that inevitably leads to a different kind of education.
Maybe the education doesn't always come from a university.
And maybe it doesn't, indeed.
Very good. That's a great question. Thank you. Our next question comes to us from the Instituto Politécnico in Mexico, DF.